you have heard of urban sprawl and possibly smart growth, and this lecture will focus on the issues associated with urban sprawl. So let's define sprawl and smart growth. Sprawl development, according to the Greenbelt Alliance, which is a think tank that studies these issues, it's the outward expansion of low-density housing units on the outskirts of cities far from commercial centers. So in other words, sprawl development is essentially what we consider to be the suburbs, and in the suburbs the lots tend to get bigger and it tends to be further from your house to shopping or your house to work. And so that would be considered sprawl development. Smart growth, on kind of the opposite end, is the approach to development that encourages a mix of building types and uses. So that would explain, mixing houses with places of work with places to shop. And the diverse housing and transportation options. So can you bike, can you walk, can you go on mass transportation, and also can you drive? And then development within existing neighborhoods. So rather than expanding out into natural environments, are there places within existing developments where there's still space that you can infill housing or shopping or workplaces? And then of course with smart growth, it's encouraged to engage the community so that you're determining what the needs are for that community. So the United States, our population is still growing. Some of that is from immigration, some of that is from birth rates. And it is projected to grow from 310 million to 439 million over the course of the years of 2010 to 2050. So when I'm recording this lecture, we're right on we're almost ready for our next census, and then we'll know better how many people we have in 2020, but as of now, those are the numbers we have. So that's a projected 42% increase in population in the next, now 30 years, but over a 40-year time period. Almost every metropolitan area has expanded in land area since 1950, and the reason that's very interesting is because there are many cities, especially in the Northeast and northern Midwestern states, that are actually losing population, and yet their footprint, the amount of land that they're taking up, is still expanding. Another issue associated with urban sprawl is the fact that we're driving farther. So vehicle travel has increased sixfold, or 6 times, the distances and the amount of travel from the years 1950 to 2011. And this is all data that comes from the EPA, from their Smart Growth website. So this is, if you look at that, we're traveling 6 times as many miles. However, our population has only doubled in that time. So on average, each person is traveling 3 times as far as the person did in 1950. That is starting to taper off in recent years. The rate of growth has tapered off, and actually, so it's starting to kind of level off. Safety implications are that because we're in the car so much, car crashes are the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States, if you look at it in terms of the years of life lost. And that's because many crash victims are young. So when a crash victim, a young person, dies in a car accident, that's many years of life lost. So car crashes are an important safety issue and an important health and life issue. And then that's only second to, or third to, cancer and heart disease in terms of years of life lost. So here's just a graph to show you how our vehicle miles traveled in the United States has increased over time. So since 1970, it's gone from a little over 1 trillion miles a year, and then in 2015, it's upwards of more than 3 trillion miles per year. So how does this affect the environment? Well, in terms of species diversity, or the catchphrase we tend to use, biodiversity, we see that there's a decline in biodiversity whenever you increase any of these urban factors. So when we pave more surfaces for roads or parking lots, that's going to decrease biodiversity. As road density increases, that decreases biodiversity. The longer development has been in place, the more of a decline you see in biodiversity. Human population, as that increases, you see a decrease in biodiversity, and similarly with building density. So I'm going to talk about water and air separately and how they're impacted by sprawl. So water is impacted whenever you have sprawl, because whenever you have a development, the quantity, quality, and diversity of stream habitats decreases. Part of that is due to water pollution, because whenever you have more roads and manicured yards, there tends to be more non-point source pollution that occurs as runoff into these natural streams systems. There's also less exposed soil in these developments that can absorb water and also filter water, and so the runoff volumes increase because that water isn't going to the soil, it's just running off into storm drains into the streams. So you have a lot more unfiltered water that runs off very quickly, and it can cause flooding. And then as water quality declines in these natural water systems, it becomes unfit for drinking, swimming. The fish in there are not good to eat, and also there's loss of diversity in fish life and all of the different organisms that live in these aquatic systems. In terms of air quality, we see that as we're traveling more in our vehicles, we're emitting more carbon monoxide, more nitrogen oxides, and so just more carbon in general is that should be CO2, I believe, but it might be, both are increasing, carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, and that's a 38% increase. So as we increase miles, we're increasing the number of emissions. It's important to note that the greenhouse gas emissions have only increased by 19% from 1990 to 2010, even though our vehicle miles have increased more than 19%. We are having, those miles are more efficient because of more fuel efficient vehicles. I'm not sure how well that trend will continue as people are buying larger cars now, and so that is an issue that may or may not continue to improve. Another thing that, as we have bigger houses that are further apart, we also have more electricity needed for homes and offices, and these are also major sources of atmospheric pollutants. These electricity generating power plants often are burning fossil fuels. And then just to talk about where are we expanding into. So counties that have particularly high rates of development, they tend to be prime farmlands. So we're losing our prime farmlands to development. From 1992 to 2012, we lost 31 million of acres of farmland to development. And then another 11 million were lost to commercial, residential, and industrial development. So that's, that 11 million is out of the 31 million of acres of farmland. So we're losing this prime farmland, and these farmlands can be habitats for wild critters in addition to being good for growing crops. The last thing I want to discuss with issues of urban sprawl is the urban heat island effect. And this isn't really just associated with urban sprawl, but more as how we develop our cities. So when our cities are covered with dark pavement and dark roofs, those pavements and roofs, all of those tend to absorb energy, and this can cause heating in an urban environment. And then there's further insult to that environment because of the lack of trees and vegetation, which can reduce, those would normally provide shade for people and animals, birds for example, which helps to cool the city. And it also helps to cool the city because these trees and plants have evapotranspiration that sends water out into the air and helps to cool it off through evapotranspiration. But when we don't have all of these, then more more sunlight is hitting that pavement surface or roof surface, and that causes more heating. So as a result, urban areas can be between 6 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than rural areas nearby. So we see that in downtown Phoenix. It's much warmer in the summer in downtown Phoenix than it is outside of the city. So as a result, this is a major health issue because heat is a major killer actually in terms of natural disasters. Even though it's not something that's dramatic, that you see, it's not a big storm that comes in and hurts people quickly all at once. It's something that every day we lose people to heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So heat stroke and exhaustion, they especially impact poor people who can't afford air conditioning as well. They can't afford to turn their air conditioning down as low. And it also impacts elderly people more because they are not as able to cope with the high temperatures. So a 10% Fahrenheit degrees increase in temperature leads to a 2% increase in mortality rate due to heat stroke and exhaustion. So it is quantifiable. We do know that it is happening, and as temperatures increase with global climate change, this is even more and more of an issue. Excuse me, another thing that we see is that as you increase temperatures, so especially in an urban heat island, cars produce more VOCs, volatile organic carbon, in their emissions, which leads to an increase in ozone production. And ozone is a major air quality issue, so air quality decreases, and the health impacts of that temperature increase compounds because you're not just dealing with the fact that it's hotter, but also the fact that there's more pollutants in the air. And this is also from an EPA report. I put a link to it here. If you wanted to read more, there's so much information out there about all of the different impacts of sprawl and urban development on the environment that you can read hundreds of pages.